Students, I wanted to give you a little bit of information on a black and white painting, which especially Maya Noble had some interest in um, learning about based on some of her black and white paintings of flowers and her real interest in grisaille. So in this, I'm going to show you a few historical examples. These are all sort of master works. And I've also included a few paintings that are do have a little bit of color, browns perhaps, a little bit of blue or yellow, but they are tonalist paintings, which kind of means that they're very limited in their palette. And frankly, they could be black and white if the artist so chose. So the first painter we're going to take a look at is the French painter Ingres. So Ingres is considered a neoclassicist, and his time frame is, the early to mid 1800s. And Ingres is a consummate draftsman. He draws very, very well. He was schooled in what would have been the academy, or an academic approach to drawing and painting, which basically means that there's a very strong formula for how students learn. They start with simple forms in black and white, geometric forms and solids, maybe moving to plaster casts or drawing from marble busts. And it would take quite a while. They would have to perfect each step in this process before moving on to the next element. And ultimately, they would arrive at drawing from the human figure, but not before having drawn from plasters or statuary, or maybe going to a museum like the Louvre at the time and drawing from classical statuary. Hence the term neoclassicism. It's the new classicism. And it's kind of based on all the things you know about, perhaps Renaissance art. Symmetry is really important. Good compositional geometry, and really deft handling of surfaces. So that's his background. He was really highly influenced by artists of both the Flemish and the Italian Renaissance. And in this slide, you see on the left an odalisque, and on the right something that's sort of based off a classical Greek or Roman statuary piece, but it's a contrapposto model pouring water. Almost like a nymph or something you might see in a classical painting. And Ingres intentionally left things black and white at times to show off his skill at modeling. So it's very intentional that he did things in black and white, and he saw it as a way to kind of show others his prowess. So this next couple of painters are considered realists. We're going to look at Thomas Eakins, who's an American painter. Actually, both are Americans, Thomas Eakins and Whistler. Their time period is the mid to late 1800s, it's kind of the heyday. But and truly in this slide, these are Eakins paintings, and they do have a limited palette. There are, if you look up more of Eakins' paintings, including one of his most famous, which is the Gross Clinic, which is a surgery painting. It's largely black and white. These, although they have a little bit of kind of brown and maybe a touch of blue in the painting on the right, they're largely tonal paintings. And they do highlight the notion. These very well could be black and white, and This next slide is also an Akins, and it is this another Akins, and it's also probably a study, and this one is nearly entirely black and white. There's he may have used a little bit of blue sort of as the black in the central figure, and there's a little bit of blue black behind the head of the left hand figure. But again, largely a tonal painting, and you can see his clear use of white as the highlight areas of the figures. Now, moving to Whistler. Whistler is, again, an American painter. Akins was based in Philadelphia. That's kind of where he made his career. Whistler was um, educated in Europe and in Paris specifically, and then ultimately settled in London, England. And I spoke about this painting last week, but Whistler's Mother, or it actually has a title of Arrangement in Black and Gray is the real title, is what's considered Whistler's tonalist paintings, or an example of that. And even though there's a tiny little bit of color, it's largely tonal. It's largely black and white. And Whistler, wrote about and talked about this notion of tonalism, where paintings were basically lodged in one hue band and executed across the tones of that. So the painting on the right is a nocturne, which means night painting, and it's one of his more famous. And although blue and yellow, and I think it's entitled Nocturne in Blue and Gold, or Nocturne in Blue and Yellow, very well could, again, have been executed as kind of a black and white painting. Now, these next few slides are by Charles Birchfield, and Birchfield's one of my favorite landscape painters. Birchfield grew up in central Ohio, small town, Salem, Ohio, and was inspired by reading people like Thoreau, so he was very, very inspired by nature. And he is most known for doing these, fairly heroic scaled watercolors. He also, just, FYI, made his living by designing wallpaper and fabrics before he, gained an audience and began to sell paintings. But he is, in his time frame is, typically, he graduated from art school in 1916, and so, it's typically, around the time period like World War I era. He lived into the 1960s and continued to work. His painting draws from modernism, and he was aware of, French painting, Picasso and Braque and Matisse, and, things that were happening in Europe. And he's a little bit like Edward Hopper in that he sort of rejected some of that. But unlike Hopper, he did embrace elements of it. And in these, you can see, kind of great liberties taken with natural forms. And so he, although he sort of rejected the cubist notion, breaking things into geometric shapes, he does somewhat abstract elements of the landscape and, take liberties with them in order to create kind of symbolism and around the landscape. A lot of people, might characterize him as an anthropomorphic painter, where houses, trees, plants clouds, weather, take on almost a human persona. And when looking at this slide, if you take a look at the image on the left, um, the kind of gaping holes in the trees almost look like mouths with teeth, or the tree on the left, the two little holes at the root of the tree, sort of look like eyes, and so you find this characteristic in a lot of Birchfield's work. But he's a very, very dynamic painter. Uh, this is another Birchfield, and this is a fairly dramatic example of kind of what he would do with weather, and where the clouds and the sky, take on this really sort of ominous feel. The trees, those bent branches are, highly angularized, and again, almost feel like they're sort of alive and could reach out for you. And I guess, if you're thinking about a tree that sort of might, in cinema that might look like this, it's be sort of like the trees in The Wizard of Oz when they're walking through that dark forest, and the trees, are trying to capture them, or so Birchfield, put human characteristics into many facets of nature. And the other thing I do want to reiterate is that all of these paintings, although there are hints of color, they are also very tonal and largely could be black and white. Many painters think about, I've heard this quote many times, but there are some painters that kind of hold to the notion that painting is merely drawing with a brush. So if you take the elements of your drawing classes and just add a brush or a liquid medium and have it be black and white, you are indeed painting. The next painter I'd like to draw your attention to is Mondrian. And, Mondrian, the one, the paintings in the art history books you usually get a look at, is perhaps this painting on the left, which represents the distill movement that Mondrian was involved in. And Mondrian is from the Netherlands, and that particular movement is also called neoplasticism. And so when you see the word neo in anything, it means new. So the new plasticism. And, really there were a few painters and a couple of writers that sort of adhered to this, and they were all from the Netherlands, that adhered to this sort of philosophy that artists would ultimately pare things down to abstract forms and get away from realism, and that would represent a kind of more true sort of painting. And this tree is a nearly cubist rendition of a tree. And Mondrian, there's a series of these trees where he actually, moves through the same tree form, gradually making it more and more abstract. So I like to talk about Mondrian because, I've mentioned before, when you talk about abstraction, one of the approaches to abstraction is what's called the destruction of the object, where you would be looking at something, objects or something real in nature, and disassembling it or simplifying it, breaking it down to its essences. And that they might be geometric essences, they might be just color essences, but the image itself starts with an object. And these two Mondrians, the one on the left and the one on the right, both represent that. Obviously, the one on the right is a still life, and you can see how he has pared this down to very simple geometry, but it's still representative of an object. And, in this slide, Obviously, the slide on the left is pure black and white. The one on the right is very tonal. It's got the characteristics of brown, and is probably more influenced by Cubism. Those brown hues were often used by Picasso and Braque in early analytical Cubism. And, Mondrian, these are also Mondrians. Mondrian, gradually moved. He has kind of an early period and a middle period and a late period. And ultimately, Mondrian wound up in the U.S. During World War II. He fled from, Paris to England, and then ultimately, when the Nazis took France, he came to New York. And one of the paintings you're always sort of shown in an art history book is Broadway Boogie Woogie, which kind of represents New York in Mondrian's later style. And the painting on the right is part of that later style. It kind of represents the ultimate in pared down simplicity. And the painting on the left is slightly earlier, and is kind of in between the prior slide and his sort of mature late period, very minimal abstractions. Again, however, although the painting on the right has this band of red, if you look at his work or look up images of his work, you'll find plenty of examples of purely black and white painting. So, among the greatest practitioners of painting in black and white is Pablo Picasso. And Picasso is considered a modernist. He's, kind of, turn of the century forward. Picasso lived into the 60s. And, he had very clear styles that he moved through. But in his, kind of late modernist phase, he did lots and lots of black and white work. He was also very fond of making ceramics, and a lot of the ceramic work is a black figure on a white ground. But this is an example of one of his black and white paintings, based on figures in an interior. And perhaps the most famous, and probably one you're a little bit familiar with, is the next painting. So this painting is Guernica, and it's a Picasso. It's a huge scale painting done in response to the bombing of a small town in Spain during the takeover of the fascists, the Spanish Civil War. And this, it's one of his most iconic images. It's also become one of the most iconic images that represents war. And again, it's a great example of painting in black and white. And I have another slide here I want to show you of the painting, just to let you see how large this work is compared to a human being. It's quite tremendous in scale. So there you have it installed. It's in Spain. I've actually seen this painting in person, and it is a very heroic scale, and it has quite a presence when you stand in front of it. So speaking of scale and black and white painting, this is a painting by Jackson Pollock, and it represents one of his most iconic drip paintings. And we've talked a little bit about abstract expressionism, and Pollock is a key figure in that movement, and that movement is centered in New York City. It's centered on kind of the mid to late 1950s, maybe a little earlier. Elements of it begin in the late 40s, and it evolves through the 50s. And it does have roots in a couple of things. One is the notion of automatic painting, the, the notion that the artist is a conduit, and that the marks the artist makes are, he's responding to some sort of very spontaneous and deep um, current that's moving through him. He or she, I should say. Um, so these are, you know, he, Pollock worked on these things on the floor of his studio and walked around them. They're quite large, very, maybe, 9, 10, 12 feet in length, 6 feet tall, something like that. And he used all kinds of crazy paints. They used aircraft paint and highway paint and automotive paint and industrial kinds of materials. You often, and this is the case, you often find them painting on raw canvas that's unprimed, and as a result, too, some of these materials don't have the longevity that like an archival painting formula might, and so discoloration would occur sometimes, and sometimes fairly rapidly. And most of these painters were okay with that notion. That was, something they sort of embraced in the work. Another black and white painter, notably black and white painter, is Franz Kline, and he's also of the abstract expressionist era. And I really want to draw your attention to Kline because Kline grew up in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, and he's actually buried there in the main cemetery that's right along the river. And Kline was a very prominent figure in the abstract expressionist movement, and most notably for these very, very brushy, textural renditions in black and white. And you might think that these are, not very studied works, but Kline was a real practitioner of doing small studies for these paintings before, taking them up to a large scale. And one of his favorite sketchbooks was the telephone book. He liked the black and white text and the repetitive nature of the black ink on that sort of like brownish white paper, grayish white paper, as a base for paintings. And he would do ink studies on phone book pages. And then ultimately, when he kind of arrived at an idea, he would then take them up to a much bigger scale. And, Kline has a couple of periods as well. Like his early work is a little bit sort of based on American regionalism. Like, they were sort of like fairly recognizable paintings of coal country landscapes and things like that. And many people have said, including I think Kline, hinted around a little bit that, some of this black and white imagery stems from industrial kinds of scenes that he saw as a young boy growing up in the coal region. A couple of other painters that are more in the color field type of abstraction would be Joseph Albers. And, Joseph Albers wrote a very popular book that is often used as a text in color theory courses called The Interaction of Color. He actually became the first head of the painting department at Yale University when Yale started an art program post-World War II. And, he was very interested in optics and optical illusions and how colors interacted. So his interest in optics and tessellations and things like that led him to do lots of these black and white studies, as you see in this slide. And, typically when you see Albers' work in art history books, it'll be, more of his kind of color field work where he's, um, dealing with, squares or different size squares of color and they're fairly brightly colored on canvas. But he was a very strong practitioner of working in black and white. Another painter of the color field variety that you may not have heard of is Ad Reinhardt. And Ad Reinhardt is a very prominent figure in that movement. And he is well known for doing a series that's called the Black Paintings. And this is an example of an installation, and I use this because when you look at just a slide of an Ad Reinhardt painting, in some cases it's really, really hard to see or distinguish the subtle differences in the blacks he's using. But this slide actually shows them pretty well, and perhaps these are less subtle black paintings, but they're all comprised of shades of dark gray and black. And this is very indicative of his work. And again, he was a very notable figure in the color field movement. Now, a more contemporary painter, and one that leaps to my mind almost immediately, contemporary painter using black and white, is the artist Chuck Close. And Chuck Close emerged in the 60s, 70s as a photorealist. And the example on the left is an early photorealist example. And so Chuck Close has always done work of this nature. They're nearly always faces. They are nearly always done from photographs. So he photographs a person, and typically he doesn't select models based on beauty or any sort of ideal. He selects his friends and kind of regular people that he's just interested in the details of their face. And one of the interesting things about Chuck Close is he actually suffers from a condition, and I can't remember the name of it exactly, but it's a true condition where he could look at your face and speak to you, and then look away, and like 30 seconds later not recognize who you are. It's something to do with recognition of facial recognition. And so his work in this area is really almost like a mapping of the features. So he works from grids usually. He would take a photograph, blow it up, grid it off, and then create a grid on a canvas that was scaled to that grid, and he would paint each little area in moving around like a map, kind of top to bottom or corner to corner, almost in a formulaic fashion. And on the left, he used to, in his early work, he used an airbrush, and the picture on the right is done much later, and he really begins to sort of break the face up into these little squiggles and circles, and there's a little element, I guess, if all of you sort of thought of Nick Nace's last little abstraction where it was all circles, you can see elements of that in this grid, where a circle motif is repeated and repeated and repeated. And again, Close uses color. He's spectacular at using color, but he has always and continues to use black and white as kind of fundamental to his practice. These are just two more examples of an early and a later Chuck Close painting. And I wanted to give you some indication of the scale of these. So the next slide just shows an installation of a few of these paintings in a gallery. Um, so this is just designed to show you how large these are. They're quite big, and it's quite imposing when you see a, 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 a figure painting this large and kind of done in this hyper realist style. So there's a few examples of painting in black and white, and the notion that you would do a grisaille and decide not to add the color, that is perfectly acceptable. And a lot of these painters, I think, have chosen black and white because it has very strong graphic qualities that maybe are sometimes obscured by color. And I also would like to mention that many painters, and they do this for a variety of reasons, but many painters will begin to work in printmaking and as a graphic arts form, and you'll find an image that maybe they've done in painting. Rembrandt was a great practitioner of this. They do a painting and then do several iterations of a print from that, either woodblock or an etching or something like that. And one of the reasons they do that is because of the graphic qualities of just pure black and white, and how it heightens the marks of the drawing, and sometimes breathes a different kind of life into an image. So I would encourage you to kind of embrace the notion if you haven't, and but please know that it is a perfectly acceptable way to paint. And that's the end.